Hi everybody, thank you for joining this meeting. We're very pleased to have this Green Day Symposium for the Institute of Neurology. I'm Mike Hanna, the director of the Institute, and we've got three talks today addressing different aspects of sustainability, the impacts of climate change, and three very good speakers who I'll introduce. Just by way of background, so the Institute has been actively involved in promoting sustainability agenda in line with UCL's strategy on this for some time now. And actually, our colleagues across ION have done a lot of really good work. So, for example, in terms of lab sustainability, we've had a number of awards improving how our labs operate in a more sustainable way. And at the 2020 awards, we actually got 3 gold, 1 silver and 7 bronze awards to labs at Queen Square Institute of Neurology, which is really great. And we've also had awards for office sustainability and green activities with 3 golds and 1 silver. I want to also just highlight our green champions at Queen Square, the Institute of Neurology, and thank them. Sarah Lawson, who is the office sustainability champion, and Steffi Chizo, the laboratory sustainability and green champion, who've both done an excellent job. I don't really have to tell anybody, this is such an important issue, and we have made and are making pledges as an institute to make sure we do all we can to drive things in the right direction for sustainability. And we have actually met the pledges that we made for 1920. These are modest things, but I think they all matter. So we now only have vegetarian catering, and at any events, obviously at the moment with lockdown, events are not happening, but we were only providing vegetarian catering and avoiding any plastic water bottles. We have an ION-wide leaf group for lab sustainability. We have entered into furniture and equipment recycling platforms, the Warp IT platform, successfully. We were involved in the Easter and Christmas switch-offs to reduce energy consumption during college closure days. We're also part of the non-hazardous lab recycling programs. And ION lab staff have also actively participated in working with suppliers to reduce packaging on items that we're getting delivered. So we're starting to actively be more and more involved in initiatives to contribute to sustainability, and we expect that to only increase over time. And I just want to thank all of you who contributed to that, and as I say, particularly to thank Sarah Lawson and Steffi. So I'm now going to introduce the first talk. We've changed the order slightly. So first is going to be Professor Sanjay Sisodiya, Department of Clinical and Experimental Epilepsy at UCL, consultant neurologist. He's done a lot of work on climate change in relation to epilepsy, both nationally and internationally. And actually, Sanjay was key in planning and proposing that we had our first green symposium for the Institute. So I'm very pleased now to introduce Sanjay for the first talk. The talk will be about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes questions. You can put your hand up or put something in the chat if you do have a question. So if Sanjay, you're happy to share your slides, we'll start with your talk.
Great, thank you very much, Mike. So I'm going to be speaking about climate change and its potential impact in epilepsy and for people with epilepsy. As Mike said, in a sense, we don't need to make the argument anymore for climate change being a phenomenon. And we've seen articles like this signed by 11,000 scientists from around the world telling us what's happening and why we need to do something about it. And I guess, in a sense, You know, one wonders why we are talking about this in the middle of a pandemic when there are so many pressures on the system. I guess it's precisely because the pandemic shows us what can happen and how we can respond to a global emergency. However you look at this, however you look at this, whichever metric you take, there's no doubt that things are deteriorating. Average temperatures rising, a greater proportion of hot summers are occurring, carbon emissions are increasing. All of these metrics in some occasions I think become quite difficult to digest and to relate to everyday life. But actually, if you think about your everyday life and what's happening, I think you can begin to see that things really are changing. Here are some bluebell woods in the Chilterns. I've been walking in these now for over 20 years. But residents on our road who've been walking here for 70 years say they've never seen bluebells flowering as early as they currently are, some 2 to 3 weeks in advance of where they normally would be. And I think it's important to try to relate all this information that we see, all these graphics that we see, to our everyday life and also to our everyday professional lives, and think, what impact might climate change have for the people we see and look after, and how might we be contributing to the problems that are occurring? So this really was brought home to me by this group of people, a really amazing group of families, carers, patients with Dravet Syndrome. You'll know this as a very rare epileptic encephalopathy with difficult to treat seizures and a range of comorbidities. And it was really people with this condition I was seeing in clinic who were saying their seizures were proving more difficult to control than ever during the very hot summers that we were having. And I guess this made me think about what climate change might really mean for people with epilepsy. There's now a lot of anecdotal evidence gathered by, for example, Dravet Syndrome UK, that actually seizure patterns are changing and becoming more difficult to treat during the very hot summers. And anecdotal reports suggest that actually this can even prove fatal. As you know, this is a temperature-sensitive epilepsy, and there's a report of a young girl with Dravet syndrome whose seizures were well controlled until she went wandering out in a very hot day in Melbourne, 46 degrees heat, and was found dead, presumed pseudo. So there are many factors that are likely to be operative, and I want to go through some of these for the people we see with epilepsy and think about how this might affect people with epilepsy. And I think one of the things that's becoming clear is that the people who have the least resilience are likely to be affected first and most severely by the changes that climate change will bring about. And as we've seen with the pandemic, even in well-resourced, well-developed health systems, significant challenges occurring at a global scale can produce significant stress to the point of breakage. But what we've also seen is that these dramatic changes that can occur so quickly can be met with dramatic responses. And in comparison, we know a lot more about climate change. It's a slow burning problem, but it is one that really needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. And I think the example of the pandemic really should drive us to thinking about this more and more. So this is really what this is about. If we look at the distribution of temperatures, what we're seeing with climate change is that not only is there an increase in the mean, which means that we see more hot weather, but there's also an increase in the variance. And when you put these two together, what you end up with is not just more hot weather, which we are obviously all experiencing, but even more record hot weather. And we've seen that typically across Europe in the last decade, where many of the hottest years on record have occurred within the last decade. And it's the especially hot weather that's going to prove a challenge, especially for many people with the difficult to treat epilepsies. So we see here an example of this at the molecular genetic level. These are recordings from sodium channels from the SCN1A and AV1.1 channel. And you can see that as you change the temperature from 21 degrees C to 37 degrees C, the characteristics of behavior of this channel change. And what's also clear from this study is that actually this change in channel characteristics brought about by a change in the ambient temperature is aggravated in the presence of a mutation. So you see the divergence here between these two plots, meaning that actually people who have epilepsies associated with mutations in the gene that encodes this channel potentially are more susceptible to the effects of increasing ambient temperature. Now, of course, it's very important to distinguish between ambient temperature and body temperature. Humans, of course, are excellent at thermoregulation. But we also know that there are some impairments of thermoregulation in people who have some of these rare epilepsies. And it's not just in the rare epilepsies that this is going to be important. If we look at some of the more common epilepsies, for example, mesial temporal lobe epilepsy with hippocampal sclerosis, we know that there's a common variant in SCN1A that is strongly associated with this type of epilepsy. And what additional work has shown is that this SNP is associated with increased expression of SCN1A rather than a reduced expression of SCN1A that we see in Dravet syndrome. And when we increase expression of SCN1A in a zebrafish model, as done here by Camila Esguerra's group, we see actually that these zebrafish become increasingly sensitive to ambient temperature. So as you increase the ambient temperature, the proportion of the mutant fish that end up convulsing increases significantly. So at a molecular genetic level, there's good reason to think that as temperatures rise and as extreme weather becomes more common, and as thermoregulation can be challenged, then we can expect that the underlying pathophysiology will be aggravated by these temperature changes, making seizures in people who already have common and rare epilepsies more likely to occur. And if we look at the genetic risk for febrile seizures, so we all have common variants that influence our susceptibility to develop seizures with fevers, not with ambient temperature, but with fevers, then we see actually that people who have epilepsy have a higher endogenous innate risk, if you like, for febrile seizures because of their genetic makeup. Now, of course, fever and ambient temperatures are not the same things, but fever is associated with other features that can make seizures more likely to occur, such as inflammation. And of course, what we're also predicting with climate change is that some of the causes of fevers are going to become more common and more widespread. So for example, the territory, the range of this vector, Aedes albopictus, will spread as temperatures rise across Europe. So this is its current range here, which is mainly, as you see, in the Mediterranean area. But these authors predicted that with a 2-degree rise of global temperatures, then within just a decade, we're going to see that this mosquito, which is a vector for various pyrexial infectious illnesses, such as dengue fever and chikungunya, will spread and will be active even within London for some weeks of the year as temperatures rise. And we see, of course, how emerging pathogens can take health services by surprise and can overwhelm health services very easily, as we've seen through the pandemic. So as global temperatures rise, we see the spread of vectors that spread infections that not only cause epilepsy, but can cause fevers. And so we will see again the risk for seizures becoming worse in people with established epilepsy and for an increasing risk of epilepsy occurring as a result of some of these infectious diseases. So this is really multifactorial. There are many aspects of climate change that are potentially likely to affect people with epilepsy specifically. And of course, we need to think more broadly about other neurological diseases that might also be affected by temperature and by inflammation. And if we look at the effects of huge events, of catastrophic events, we can look back, for example, at the Great East Japan earthquake, which many of you will remember from just a decade ago. The fourth biggest earthquake in the last century took place here and had a huge effect on the infrastructure of a highly developed nation, Japan. To the point where, of course, there were many people who were killed, unfortunately, went missing or injured, and extensive damage to buildings and infrastructure. Now, this has nothing to do with climate change, but we know that floods and droughts, for example, are events that are going to become more likely to occur as a result of climate change. And what this means, of course, is that supply chains will be affected. We've already seen that to a small degree with Brexit. We've already seen that with the pandemic, and it's likely to occur with events like, for example, these global changes occurring associated with climate change, as illustrated by this, by the earthquake in Japan. So if you look at this simple metric here, did the patient have sufficient medication during the acute phase of disaster after the earthquake? A quarter of people didn't. Half of people who had problems with their epilepsy were unable to contact their clinicians, simply as a result of disruption of infrastructure. And this kind of event is going to become more common as time goes on with climate change. And of course, we might think, this is a really once in a lifetime event, but of course we know it's not. This is a typical scene in the first phase of the pandemic here in the United Kingdom last year. And interestingly, through the Epilepsy Advisory Group, we spent a lot of time over the last year dealing with the threat and the occurrence of drug shortages, which were themselves multifactorial, but which demonstrated the fragility of the supply chains with which our patients have to deal with on a regular basis. And this is not only emotionally, psychologically stressful for people, but of course, if you have epilepsy and you're missing your anti-epileptic drugs, then you're much more likely to have seizures, and some of those seizures are going to be serious and even life-threatening. What about our own contributions to climate change? So this is a very simple anecdotal graphic looking at the average carbon emissions in 3 different countries, the US, the UK, and Australia. So if you live in the UK, then the average carbon emissions for a person in the UK about 6 tons each year. These red rectangles on top are the additional carbon emissions that three of us, so this is me, this is Dan Lowenstein, who is a very eminent epileptologist in the US, and this is Ingrid Scheffer, who's also an eminent epileptologist in Australia. So these red boxes are the additional carbon emissions each of us produced by flying around the world to conferences in 2017. I didn't do that much because I'm not that keen on traveling. Dan too doesn't do that much. Unfortunately, Ingrid, who has to fly everywhere to get anywhere, pretty much doubled the carbon emissions for people average people in her country. And if you look at the Society for Neuroscience meeting in 2014 in Washington, then the authors of this report calculated actually that the travel footprint alone for people attending this meeting was about 22,000 metric tons. That's about the annual carbon footprint of 1,000 labs. And if you drive about 10 miles a day, that generates about a ton of carbon dioxide a year. So this is a huge contribution made by people traveling to this meeting. Now, of course, we all know the importance of meetings, and we all know what happens in those informal discussions that you have at meetings that can really set the science going. But there is a balance to be had here. If you add up all the medical meetings over the course of a year, not just epilepsy, not just neuroscience, but the medical meetings, the carbon emissions just for travel, not for the hotel stays, not for the taxi rides, nothing else, just for the airline flights themselves, amount to about the same emissions as the entire nation of Madagascar. Very few people from Madagascar go to these meetings, but the people from Madagascar, the people who are going to suffer most, amongst others, from the effects of climate change. And I think these are all part, these observations are all part of the picture of climate change, including for epilepsy. Now, in epilepsy, of course, we know that things are very complicated, and we know there are lots of things that can provoke seizures. And here we see the effects, for example, of lack of sleep. Lots of things happen as a result of lack of sleep. Climate change makes lack of sleep worse. In fact, a 1 degree rise in temperature, nighttime temperature, is associated with an increase of 3 nights of self-reported insufficient sleep per 100 people per month. And if you have a medical condition that is made worse by lack of sleep, then you can easily see how the discomfort caused by rising temperatures, particularly at night, can again lead to factors which will increase the chances of seizures occurring. So there's really many ways in which we can see that the impact of climate change is likely to make life for people with epilepsy worse. And this will happen unequally across the world. We've seen how inequality has been brought out by the pandemic. The same will happen with climate change. This is not going to be an equal physical phenomenon across the world, and neither will the response across the world be equal. There are going to be nations that can be able to cope with it better, and others that are going to be able to cope with it less well. And we know that in Africa, South Central America, and Southeast Asia, regions where there is already a significant treatment gap in epilepsy, that climate change is going to have an even more marked effect in those nations than it is in others. So the reality today, if you look at certain ecosystems, for example, if you just look at pond life, you can see that these ecosystems are already changing. This is not something for 10, 20, 50 years down the line. It's for today. And this very nice study in Science looked at the multiplicative impacts across different levels of climate change We've seen how it can have an effect at the molecular genetic level, at the drug supply level, at the level of physical comfort and sleep, all of these things that can impact upon seizure control in epilepsy. And many of these levels are going to be affected. And we've seen this can happen already in simple ecosystems like ponds, where species are changing and the nature of species are changing as a result of existing degrees of climate change. If you then ask people with epilepsy what they think, so this was a very simple survey that we did actually during one of the heat waves last summer in a slightly less busy time during the pandemic. And there were about 1,000 people who took part in this survey, and most of them, although they were concerned about the psychological consequences of climate change, were also very keen not to hide this away and not to stick their heads in the sand, but actually to confront the problem and to begin to understand what the impacts of climate change might be for people with epilepsy. So partly in response to this, we set up this group called Epilepsy Climate Change. There's about 100 people from clinicians to patient groups to industry to basic scientists who've joined this. And our aim is to undertake research to find out more about this, to try and quantify the risks better, to raise awareness with events like this, and to take action to see what we can do even before we know what the full consequences might be, because we know that it's already happening. If you're interested, please do just get in touch. And what we're doing is engaging with various organizations. We're surveying the opinions and effects on people with epilepsy, reviewing what little information already exists and trying to promote research, such as looking at the effects of temperature and humidity on various aspects of the epilepsy. For example, using longitudinal data that we have out at Chalfont, where we have records, for example, going back over several decades, associated with temperature records to see whether there might be longitudinal changes that we can observe. One of the things we're doing, and this is work with Diego Jimenez in my group and other collaborators, is looking at nationwide, in this case Ecuador, nationwide hospital admissions for people with epilepsy, and seeing how this relates to changes in climate. And Ecuador actually is a really good country to do this in, because there are so many temperature zones here, so that you can really get a comprehensive view of the effect of changes in temperature with respect to admissions to hospital for seizures. We're working with the group, with some of the groups at the Bartlett School of the Environment at UCL, and looking here to obtain data on temperature changes inside residences in the UK. We know that housing quality has a big effect on the resilience to heat waves. Some houses are much better ventilated, some are much less ventilated, and you can record those temperatures and look at the peaks. You can see here that during one hot period in this particular period, 2019, indoor temperatures in this particular environment rose up to 34 degrees C. We're using this data to look, for example, at drug stability. There is some information about anti-epileptic drug stability over temperatures, but not really in this sort of way, not looking at temperature changes occurring in this sort of pattern. The work we were doing on this has been interrupted by the pandemic, so unfortunately I can't give you the results, but we look forward to seeing what that shows. Then if we think about the NHS itself, I'm hoping that Nick Watts will be saying much more about this, but we know that the NHS is actually Europe's largest public greenhouse gas emitter, with about 21 million tons of carbon dioxide emitted each year. We're all contributing to this. Some of it's inevitable, of course, but there may be things that we can do to try and mitigate the impact of our activities. That sum is about the equivalent of the whole of the emissions of Northern Ireland for a year. Most of this comes from what we do in buildings, from drugs, their production and their distribution, and from travel. And in fact, 5% of all road traffic in 2007 was due to NHS business. It's a huge amount. And Mike's already spoken about what we can be doing in terms of reducing the carbon footprint of laboratory activities. If you think about what can be done to try to reduce carbon emissions, this is a list of things that you could do, ranging from the extreme of having fewer children to living without a car, avoiding transatlantic flights, using green energy, right down to upgrading light bulbs, which is nice but doesn't make much difference. Some of these things you can see here make the biggest difference, and the difference can vary by country. For us in the UK, living car-free can have a big effect. whereas buying green energy for us is not such an impact. But there are things that all of us can do and that we can do professionally to try to reduce our carbon emissions. Here's one example. So before the pandemic, we had various ideas to try and see what impact our activities might have on climate change and the contribution to climate change and for people with epilepsy. And one of those was to see what happened for travel for people coming to our clinics. But of course, as all our clinics have become virtual, this kind of thought experiment has become a real experiment. And what we did, and some of the fellows in the group got this data together, was to look at 10 clinics held at the Chalfont site. And the Chalfont site is really a good place to look at this because the public transport here, as some of you know, is pretty hopeless. So almost everybody who comes here has to come here by car. And so we know where people are coming to, which is roughly here. We know where people are coming from because we've got the postcodes of their residence. And so we looked at the travel over about a 6-month period when we held virtual clinics. There were about 1,500 virtual appointments, about 1,200 patients with additional attendees. And we looked to see how much travel had been saved by comparing with where they had come from in the previous year. And when you do the sums here, and you can make estimates for the sorts of cars that people drove, and whether diesel and petrol and distance traveled. The distance traveled in the end, the graphic's not working, but in fact the distance traveled in the end is about 5 times around the world for 10 clinics held at Chalfont over a 6-month period. And that's equivalent to about 36,000 tons of carbon. It's a huge amount. Now, of course, this is not to say that we can just change all our clinics to virtual. We know that we can't do that. We know that none of us want to do that. We know that our patients probably don't want us to do that completely. And we also know that this is a very simplistic calculation. We haven't taken into account the cost of the infrastructure. We haven't taken the cost of Zoom calls. We haven't taken into account the cost of the video cameras, all of these sorts of things. But actually, if you think about the fact that we already have these infrastructures in place, we already have computer networks for our hospital work, people already have cars that they use to drive around, then actually you can begin to see that there are significant savings that could be made. One of the things that we haven't finished in this work, because there's a lot of data to look through, is whether there were adverse consequences from people being seen just virtually and not face-to-face. Were there things we were missing? Were people holding back and not telling us things because they didn't want to bother us? I think all of these things are likely to come out over the next few months. But this is an illustration of the sort of evaluation that is possible to do to put our own activities into context. So what can we do? Well, if we just think about epilepsy alone, I think there are new ways of working, distributing clinical care rather than getting patients to travel, thinking about what we do in terms of conferences and reducing our carbon footprints. Mike said a lot already about labs and offices and what's happening at the Institute. This is a good website to look at if you're interested in this. And of course, thinking about what we can do to raise awareness amongst ourselves, amongst our people that we see with neurological disorders. And there are things that we can do. Some of these may have less effect, some may have greater effect, but they all add up. For example, rationalization of medication, noting that about 1/3 of the carbon emissions from the NHS are due to its medication use. Reviewing the effectiveness of immunoglobulins. All of these things have small effects, but they all have important effects when added together. And one of the things to think about is co-benefits. So there's quite a lot of psychological work being done in all of this area. And what's clear is that people are much more likely to do things if you show that there are other benefits that accrue, including benefits themselves. So if I don't drive to clinics at Chalfont, but if I run to clinics at Chalfont, then actually that makes me feel better, increases my cardiovascular efficiency, and all of those things, which are all co-benefits to doing something which actually also reduces a carbon footprint. So I'm going to end there and just thank all the organizations that have contributed to this work. And I'm very happy to take any questions.
Great, I'll unmute. That was really informative, Sanjay. Thank you for that. So we've got time for a few questions. I think Jippy has a hand up. Go ahead, we can hear you now, Jippy.
Hi, thank you, Sanjay, for the wonderful presentation. I have to say that the possible emergence of dengue in UK is in a naive population is quite disturbing and worrisome. Do you know what is the prediction about how many strains of dengue are predicted to arrive to the UK? And what are the consequences of non-classical dengue on epileptic patients?
So, Jiffy, very good question. I'm not sure that I'm really the right person to answer that. I don't think I have the right knowledge to be able to answer that properly. But I was just using dengue as an example. So we know that a number of other vector-borne infections do increase the risk of epilepsy directly. I'm not sure that dengue does that, but other virus infections do. And we know that Zika does, and Zika was quite extensively an issue in many countries not that long ago. And the ranges of many of the vectors that carry these infections are going to increase as climate change takes hold. I can't specifically answer your question, but I think it was really illustrative of the sorts of risks that we face and that we need to be planning for.
Yeah. Thank you so much. My question was born by the fact that reinfection with a different strain of dengue in an individual can drive cytokine storm and very high fever, so putting any patient at risk. And I cannot, I suppose that the epileptic patients are even more at risk in this case.
Exactly. People whose resilience is already impaired by a chronic illness, especially chronic neurological illnesses, are going to be less resilient in many ways, not only because of the pathophysiology of their conditions, but also because they have fewer resources. So I think it's going to be a multiplicative effect that we really need to be thinking about.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jitvi. Thanks, Sanjay, for a great talk. Lots to think about. I don't think there are any other questions. I'd just like to welcome some additional panelists. I'm very pleased to welcome Geraint Rees, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Life Sciences and Chair of the UCL Sustainability Group. So welcome, Geraint. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, great. Very good of you to join us, and impressed with your running medals. And I also very pleased that Nick Watts and also Richard Jackson, the other speakers in this session, have also joined. So welcome to you. So we're going to move on now to Nick Watts' talk, if that's okay. And if you can share your slides, Nick Watts, if you can hear me. Brilliant. So thank you very much for joining us. Nick is the Chief Sustainability Officer for NHS England and NHS Improvement, and he's kindly agreed to talk to us about delivering a net zero National Health Service. So thank you for joining us, Nick, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. You can hear me?
Yep, can hear you very well. Thank you.
Good. People can understand my semi-Australian accent. I've been here for a few years now.
Not really.
Not really, fair enough. Tough.
We can.
Oh dear. Look, thank you so much for having me. I think I need to apologize. I was late. Entirely my fault. Some discussions about something similar to what we're going to be talking about COVID PPE and carbon emissions that were dragging on, and temperatures were a little high. But thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Really excited to talk. I think when this conference was first conceived, probably back before we even knew the word COVID-19, if I'm not mistaken. I think I was at UCL at the time. I used to work within the Institute for Global Health, very close to where I'm sure many colleagues here currently work or used to work, as part of something called the Lancet Countdown. I've since moved on. The NHS actually came to UCL, came to many of the colleagues, Sanjay, you were talking to at the Bartlett School across IGH, and said, hey, we need help figuring out what on earth a net zero healthcare system is. I then got tricked at some point, having helped figure out that plan into the delivery side of it. I don't want to talk through too much more in terms of the impacts of climate change, the links between climate change and health beyond what has already been said. I think we've sort of had that covered off pretty succinctly for the last 20 minutes or so. The one thing that I do want to just quickly touch on is this diagram. It's useless because it doesn't really explain. It's a diagram that we made years ago in an attempt to explain the links between greenhouse gas emissions up the very, very top there, down to sort of health down the very, very bottom. I don't really think it explains anything. I think it probably does a good job of just confusing people. But the one reason I do like it is because it takes each of those individual slides that Sanjay was just talking us through, each of the individual impacts and sort of pathways through which you can imagine climate change affecting human health, the impacts on cardiovascular disease, renal health, the indirect through the combustion of fossil fuels, through shifts to vector-borne disease, changes in the burden, the pattern of distribution that you would see and expect there. And it reminds us that we're not worried about one of those things. We're not just worried about a shift in dengue fever, about a shift in Aedes aegypti, albopictus. We're not just worried about extremes of heat. We're not just worried about air pollution. We're worried about what happens when these risks compound together, when climate change correlates previously uncorrelated risks. And it's that multi-hit scenario, the sort of multi-organ effect, I think that should get us worried, should keep us up at night. Certainly, I know that's why the Lancet Countdown at UCL and why the NHS first got into this business. So on why the NHS is in this business, 3 reasons, right? It's very, very clear. Firstly, if you don't respond to climate change, it's going to smack you in the face. Climate change is currently undermining the ability of healthcare systems all the way around the world to deliver the care that they promise they will give. It gets in the way of supply chains. It gets in the way of some of those core foundational social determinants of health. It makes it difficult to provide high quality care for all now and for future generations. It's number one. Number two, I think we've touched on a little bit as well. As it turns out, if you go through and you look through the long-term plan for the NHS, 5-year, 10-year plan for the NHS, how we're going to deliver care. If you go through and read that, developed a couple of years ago, and you go through and you read forthcoming AR6, the new IPCC report coming out. They've just put out a draft for consideration a few days ago. You will see many of the interventions that you want to access for the NHS and many of the things you want to do for the IPCC, they actually overlap. For the most part, we're talking about the same thing. We are talking about cleaner air. We are talking about safer, more livable cities that create the conditions for kids to grow up and thrive. We're talking about healthier diets. We're talking about more physical activity. So you have this impact problem. You have this opportunity. On the one hand, climate change is this enormous threat to human health and to healthcare systems. On the other hand, the response is this enormous opportunity if we get it right. And thirdly, most importantly, why would the NHS take it so seriously? Because it turns out if you're an organization of 1.3 million staff who have all signed up to deliver high quality care for all now and for future generations, you've taken in some way, shape or form, directly or indirectly, a Hippocratic oath. It actually aligns incredibly closely with some of the core values. When you go out and survey NHS staff, 98% of NHS staff would like to see the healthcare system acting more environmentally sustainably. It's because intuitively, I think clinicians, theatre nurses, doctors, pharmacists, physiotherapists, when they see all of the single-use plastic, when they see ambulances idling outside a children's hospital, they understand that there's something going on there that is antithetical to that Hippocratic oath, whether you took it directly or not. Those are the 3 reasons why the NHS cares deeply about climate change, is choosing to respond in the way it has. I started by saying that UCL was tasked, and it was January 2020, was tasked by Simon Stevens, the chief executive, to come up with a plan for what a net zero healthcare system looked like. No one's thought an enormous amount about this and when you might be able to get there. So the very first thing you have to do what UCL does best, pull together all of the different disciplines you could possibly imagine from not just across the college, but across the world, and properly assess the problem, diagnose the problem. And this is a footprint, and you can cut that cake up 7 million different ways. This is a footprint of the NHS's carbon emissions, broken down. You can see here both direct and indirect, so the things that the NHS controls directly, and the areas that are in the NHS's supply chain, the people we purchase from, who we are absolutely still responsible for, but we don't necessarily control directly. When you break it down, I think a few things stand out. Firstly, and it's not on this graph, but it's scattered throughout the report, the NHS is big. 1.3 million employees, one of the largest employees in the entire world, the largest in Europe. The emissions of the NHS, they are roughly, and it depends on which day you're talking, but roughly the same size as the emissions of all of Denmark. Roughly the same size as the emissions of all of Croatia. It is a big, big institution. It's the first thing that stands out. I think the second thing that stands out to me is that the emissions are everywhere, which is either reassuring or terrifying, depending on your perspective. But there are emissions in the drugs that are prescribed. There are emissions in the way that patients, visitors, staff get to and from services. There are emissions in the buildings, in the energy that's consumed, in the waste from theatres, in the mobility aids that a physiotherapist or an occupational therapist prescribe for their patients. There are emissions everywhere. That diagram just to the right there perhaps gives you a little bit of a sense of the heat map. Obviously, it follows economic activity to some extent, so you do see those concentrations across acute care. You do see it particularly in sort of prescriptions in primary care, as you might expect, but you do see emissions everywhere. And I think that stands out. Terrifying, but also an opportunity. An opportunity because it means that no one person, no one team, the Greener NHS team that I work with, no one chief sustainability officer indeed could be possibly responsible for this. In fact, if the emissions are everywhere, you need all 1.3 million staff to be responsible for the response there. The third thing that stands out to me from this work is, one, we're big, two, everyone has a part to play, and three, there are a couple of hotspots where you could get some quick, easy wins. Anesthetic gases and metered dose inhalers stands out as something where there's a quick, easy win that you can gain access to. Looking at medicines, 20% of the NHS's emissions come from its pharmaceuticals and a few chemicals. That chemicals you can more or less ignore. It's about 2%. It's just an accounting problem with how we add all this up. Within that, you can break down the vast majority of the emissions profile for the NHS to about 20 drugs. Couple of which are directly relevant, I think, to the audience here. Those are the three important things I think that stand out to me. But the very, very last thing is that the NHS has done a heck of a lot already. The NHS has already managed to reduce its emissions, depending on the scope you pull together, by somewhere between 25 to about 50%, just over 50%. Some of that came for free. Well, not for free. It came because of things like the Montreal Protocol back in the 90s, which got rid of a couple of gases that were particularly harmful. So, having diagnosed, assessed all of those issues, we took all of this data and all of the different possible interventions you could possibly dream up to the board, to the NHS's public board. We did that sometime in October, along with Simon Stevens, the chief executive. And we said, well, listen, here's the analysis. You asked us, what does it look like? Here are the 100 or so interventions you could possibly dream up. Here is the fastest you could do it. This is what it might cost. This is what it would involve for a staff, from a staffing perspective. We think at the very, very possible earliest, the most ambitious you could possibly get, you could get to net zero by 2040 for the emissions you control correctly. For the emissions you procure from others outside of the system, 2045. And the pushback was, well, that's not soon enough. We need to be moving quicker. And so, as a bit of a back and forth, I think the compromise was, well, okay, we don't think you can actually get there much quicker because there's a last mile problem here. But what we can do is we can make that initial trajectory steeper. We think we can get an 80% reduction by 2028 at the very, very earliest. It's that kind of thinking, I think, that is sort of particularly important, particularly impressive, that gives me some confidence that the NHS uniquely is probably going to be able to do this. And hey, even if it gets 90% of the way there, that will be impressive and transformative in and of itself. It's the question that came at some point during the public board meeting. Should we really be doing this at the same time as we're trying to respond to you know, a once in a century pandemic? It was a little bit of a rhetorical question. The resounding response from every single board member came, absolutely. Now more than ever is the time that we need to be investing in the response to climate change. Indeed, you might notice, or you might not, because it happens behind the scenes, the NHS is doing an incredibly impressive amount of work in the response to COVID. Very, very quietly behind the scenes, the team that's going to be delivering a lot of this has grown exponentially. None of the climate change work has been jeopardized as a result of COVID. In fact, it has moved forward at exactly the same pace that you might expect it to, which I think is something worth being, if you work for the NHS, proud of. That's exemplified here in this, I don't know, call it a quote, call it a tweet, whichever. It's a recognition that, on the one hand, if you wait until you're done with COVID and you wait until 2022, 23, until you properly have the headspace, you will have delayed 2, 3, 4 years, and it will have become by definition impossible to meet the commitments under the Paris Agreement. That is, if you want to meet the commitments under the Paris Agreement, globally, you need to see a 7.4% annual reduction, 2020, 2021, 2022, 23, 24, 25, for 10 years. If you delay by a couple of years, only 3 years if you delay, it becomes definitionally impossible to meet the response to the Paris Agreement. And so I think the thing I just wanted to leave us with was probably that note, that in order to be able to respond to both crises, to both COVID and to the Paris Agreement and climate change, you have to do the two together. You will not be able to meet the Paris Agreement if we sit on our hands for a couple of years and wait. Conveniently, I think there's a nice moment of reorganization, of rethinking the art of the possible. I'm sure we've all used that phrase a lot recently. That comes with the response to COVID-19. And that's exactly what I think this new greener NHS team, this new net zero plan, and indeed, the new 5, 10, 20-year plan for the NHS is going to have to look like. That's all I've got. Sorry. I hope of some interest. I hope no one's asleep, but at least if they were polite enough to mute themselves.
That was really interesting. Thanks a lot, Nick. That was very informative. Thank you for taking the time to join us. These are really crucial issues, and the NHS, what did you say, the same as Denmark, the carbon output of the NHS? That's incredible, actually. So I think Geraint, did you raise a point or a question in the chat? I don't know if you want to articulate it.
Yeah, Nick, thanks. That was a great presentation. I was just really interested in new build. I mean, it's a nerdy point, right? But building new hospitals takes a lot of carbon. And I just wondered if that was in all of that diagram that you're committed to in terms of thinking about the architectural standards and how you do sustainability in terms of procurement of concrete and stuff like that, as well as all the rest of it.
Yeah, it is. It is a nerdy point, but that's the core of this, right? Previously, some of this work hadn't been the business of the NHS, and now we need to get our head around what on earth that means. Absolutely, we have 40 new hospitals coming forward. The Prime Minister's infrastructure plan for health. Those 40 new hospitals, if you want a net zero health service, they need to be net zero hospitals. You can't escape it. That is challenging because some of those are underway currently. And if you are building something currently, unfortunately, zero emission concrete doesn't yet exist. So we are today locking in to some extent, emissions that we're going to have to deal with in the future. The team responsible for doing that is aware of that. They think they've got a couple of years before they will be able to sort of produce something fully and truly net zero. I suppose I'm less worried about the things that are happening today. I'm more worried about And I'm slightly less worried about those embodied concrete emissions, Geraint. I'm more worried about, are we, as you're building a new hospital, are we understanding this hospital improvement program not as just building a new building, not as just, a new piece of infrastructure, but are we understanding it almost as a way of reimagining, rethinking what on earth healthcare looks like, right? Because the way that people use buildings are really what matters here, and the way that our clinical workforce uses it is really what matters here. So are we designing those buildings in a way that is digital first, that is modular, that is flexible, that allows us to take advantage of those new low carbon technologies as they show up? There, I think I have probably more positive news, which is yes, absolutely. There are new net zero standards that are sort of built into each of those new hospitals. Is that right, Geraint? Am I right to not be so worried, and am I up to date in terms of where the technology is at on concrete?
Richard will be the expert on concrete. I'm not the expert on concrete, but I think, certainly UCL's experiences, our mastery such that we have it to start off with has been over the last decade in getting that really deeply seated into our estates program, to the point where we can have things like our student centre, which is BREEAM outstanding. So, is in the top 1% of non-domestic buildings. I would suggest humbly that the NHS should be aspiring to have all new builds in the top 1% of public sector buildings for energy efficiency, if it's to be a standard bearer like it is in health for this aspect. But, I think the most important thing, in my view, is to do something rather than nothing. And the NHS has done nothing for a long period of time, and now it's wonderful to hear that it's doing something. So that's really, really, really pleasing.
Great.
Okay, thanks, Geraint. I think there's a point from Richard Jackson. Do you want to make a comment, Richard?
Thanks, Mike. Nick, that was a great presentation. Thank you. And probably echo what Geraint's just said. It's great to see NHS taking a lead on this. I suppose one of the challenges that I have with UCL is we've got some really good senior level commitment behind taking action on climate change, but it's then how does that play out in decision making through the organisation? And I suppose my question to you is now you've got that senior level commitment, how do you, in a massive organisation like the NHS, how do you make sure that plays out in all the different dialogues that are going on through an organisation?
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible, isn't it? 1.3 million people, that's a small country. So many ways, right? But the sorts of discussions we're starting to happen are, look, as you develop a new model of care in response to COVID, as you go through the new capital, comprehensive spending review for the government come, 21, 22, as we talk about financial spend at the national level, what's your little hook or metric that sort of catches people and says, remember this net zero commitment? And so we're building those sorts of considerations in. Indeed, each of the new contracts that will be signed as part of the NHS's procurement, give us 2 years, 3 years. We've made it pretty clear we're not going to purchase from people that don't meet or exceed our commitments on net zero, right? And so that's not an answer specifically to your question, because I think there's 7,000 answers. Isn't it find every single possible hook you can, whether it's contractual, whether it's sort of, the sort of frameworks you might put in place, and put them there. The other thing you have to do on the other side of that is those are just little footholds, right? So we have a new piece here where every single NHS organisation is going to have to develop its own green plan. It's going to have to be consistent with the net zero ambition we have there. It's going to have to be approved by their board and monitored annually by their board. That's an interesting idea, but it's basically just a foothold. And it's only really a useful foothold if there is a clinician somewhere in that hospital who jumps up and down and shouts, hey, I don't think this is good enough. I want it to be further and faster, right? And so in some ways, there's that top up which we can provide, but it only really works if there's a movement that comes ready and angry to meet it halfway.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Nick, for joining us. You're very welcome to stay. I think your time limited, but obviously it's brilliant to have had you give that talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'm really pleased now to move on to the next speaker, Richard Jackson, the Director of Sustainability Safety at UCL. and he's going to talk about sustainability at UCL. So thank you very much for joining us. Are you able to share your slides?
Okay.
Great, you can see them. That's great.
Fantastic. Okay. So just by way of introduction, yeah, I'm Richard Jackson. I'm the Director of Sustainability for UCL. I've been in post, actually, this is my 10th year at UCL, so it's been quite a journey. I started with a team of 2 people. We're now a team of 8, trying to influence an organisation of 60,000 people, as it is now, with our staff and students. And split across multiple sites, and it's nowhere near the scale of Nick's challenge, but I think actually when you look at what we've got to do, it's very similar to where Nick is, albeit at a smaller scale. But I think also within a university context, the challenge and then the opportunities are very different, and by that I mean, we as we heard from Sanjay, we're producing global research which has a potentially profound impact on the way people will be looking at climate change and wanting to get involved in climate change and wanting to drive change themselves, whether that be through lobbying or through personal action. And so the impact of our research needs to kind of come forward more, particularly around the climate change agenda. And then equally, we as an institution, alongside our competitors or collaborators, depending on how you think about them, we're producing students who are going to be, in some way or other, global leaders. Some will go into politics, some will go into business, some will move into very senior positions, and through their future work are going to have profound impacts on the way that organisations address climate change, as well as individuals. So the university itself is in itself a unique position for addressing climate change, as well as other sustainability impacts. And what I want to touch upon here is a little bit about where we are with sustainability at UCL. Talk about the strategy that we launched just over a year ago, which I think puts our university in a very bold position, very ambitious across the UK sector. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Where are we now as we've come out or not come out, but as we've gone through a year of pandemic, and then what's that mean for the Institute itself? And this is where I find that I can't actually move my slides on. There we go. Okay, so the story so far, and really I think over the past 10 years, certainly that I've been at UCL, I think we've seen quite a dramatic change in the way that UCL looks at sustainability as a value for its organisation. Over those 10 years, when I first started, our emissions were rising, and I don't think we really had an idea of how big our carbon emissions were, but also how we were going to address those. And over the past 10 years, we've seen a 30% reduction in our carbon emissions, at least those related to the energy we use. Alongside that, and I'll show you this graph in a minute, actually we do have a substantial amount of carbon emissions related to what we procure and our travel. We send zero waste to landfill, which is a relatively unknown fact, but we're one of the few universities that does that. And at the start of 2020, we made sure that we procured all our electricity from renewable sources. In terms of community engagement, so the way that we try and engage across our population is using tools like Green Impact, which some of you will be aware of, but it's a engagement tool which I suppose sets out a series of actions that different departments can take forward to address the impacts in their area. And when we started in 2012 running that program, we had 12 teams involved. Last year, 2020, we had over 80 teams who've been participating in the Green Impact programme, and we're already seeing more teams want to join up this year, even though we're in a lockdown scenario. And then alongside that, we've created a framework called the Lab Efficiency Assessment Framework, which is very much focused on how do we improve the efficiency of our laboratory environment. And we're now not only rolling that out through our university, but we've been sharing that more widely across the whole of the HEI sector, the higher education sector. I've already talked about research and teaching, and you know, when you look at UCL, I think sometimes I would certainly criticise UCL at times on this, is that we don't shout loudly enough about what we do across the field or the wide sort of range of sustainability fields. In the past year, we've launched a new website which focuses on the role of UCL in addressing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals which were set out by the United Nations. So that's now online, and that's talking more about kind of some of the research that we take forward. And then also, just before Christmas, we launched a new climate change hub, which is in part a celebration of all of our climate change research and teaching activity, but it's also trying to place UCL at the forefront of climate change research activity as we move into this year, where the COP26 discussions are going to be taking place in Glasgow in November. And all of this, I suppose, has meant that as a university, we've made huge strides forward with regards to sustainability. When I started in 2012, we were 89th out of 150 higher education and further education organisations judged in the University Green League. We're now 18th, and we're 4th within the Russell Group, which is a substantial step forward. We've been moving forward year on year. So it's a great position to be in, but also over the past 3 weeks, we've been announced as the #1 university in the Higher Education Carbon League. And what that means is we've been recognised not just for some of the measures we've been taking forward to address our emissions, but also some of the work behind the scenes to look at the data around our carbon emissions, so we know what we've got to do. Some of the programs we've put in place, both at a departmental level, but also at an institutional level, and some of the ambitious targets that we've set as an institution. So as I said already, we are probably one of the most ambitious universities in this particular area. I think the other thing to share with you all is that as a university, you know, I've been very keen that we don't just do things that create change ourselves, but we try and create change and catalyse change across our sector. And so 2 examples I want to kind of give you here of kind of the work that we've done as a team to create and catalyse wider change. Firstly, Geraint talked about buildings, and you know, as a university, we do a lot of building work, whether that's refurbishments or new buildings. And one thing that we noticed back in 2011 was that we had very few requirements that we placed on small-scale refurbishment works within buildings. And we had, because the number of projects we undertake every year, probably between 70 or 80 different small-scale projects, we had no means for systematically addressing those sustainability requirements. So we started working with the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors and created a SCAR system. SCAR doesn't stand for anything, but a SCAR system for the higher education sector, building on their existing SCAR systems. We started applying that in 2014. So now all of our minor projects, small-scale refurbishments, are required to meet a SCAR gold rating, and the majority of them do. And then once we successfully trialled it, we shared that across the sector. And what we're now seeing is more and more institutions applying the SCAR system to their small-scale works. The second thing is the LEAF programme, and I'm hoping Martin Farley's on this call, but Martin Farley has been our consultant working on this. LEAF, as I've said already, is the Laboratory Efficiency Assessment Framework. And what it is again, a set of good practice measures for applying within a lab environment to address environmental and sustainability impacts. It was developed over a number of years, building on 1 or 2 of the existing schemes. But one of the things that I suppose differentiates LEAF from other schemes is that it sets out what you're delivering in terms of the carbon emissions that you're saving, the energy you're saving. So it gives you a real sort of sense of kind of what you're achieving as a group. We rolled that out within our lab environment, and I think we've got over 50% of the UCL labs now using that. But what we also did is we started to kind of share that with other institutions across the sector. And I think at last count, we have something like 36 different institutions. We've spoken to the Wellcome Trust about them potentially using that with their partners, and they are really interested in the LEAF programme. We've also spoken to the UKRI, who are also interested in using LEAF. So what, again, we're about is trying to create and catalyse change beyond ourselves across a sector. You know, the issues of climate change are not going to be about just sorting yourself out. They are going to be about us working together to drive change. We've got challenges ahead. This is the breakdown of our carbon footprint in 2017-18, but it's largely kind of the same as we see over the past year. And the large bulk of our carbon emissions around procurement. So what we're buying in, some of the equipment we use, and how we use it. 13% related to our travel, and then around about 19% to the buildings. So really kind of as we think about what we might do to address carbon emissions and climate change, yes, we've got to do a lot of work to make sure that our estate is more efficient in the way it uses energy. But actually, more importantly, we need to think about how do we engage with our supply chain? How do we get them to actually adopt zero carbon practices? So what we're purchasing from them are zero carbon products. And that's a piece of work that we're looking at with the UCL procurement team. We also, and it's been referred to already, we're concerned about plastics and plastic use across the institution. We've done some work with our catering providers to look at removing plastics from not just coffee cups, but across some of the catering equipment that we use in the institution. But we also have made a pledge to be, or try to be, plastic free by 2024, and that I'll talk about in the new strategy. And then I suppose the other element for us is about place, and within Bloomsbury, we occupy a very urban part of London. So one of the things we've been thinking about is how do we create and work with Camden to create a place where our local environment can thrive, but also it's a place for people. So we're very interested in kind of looking at how we think about spaces and places, particularly through the capital programme that's still being delivered. We create spaces which are delivering sort of nature-based interventions, and they become spaces which actually our student and our staff can enjoy, and I suppose in some ways thrive in. So in 2019, at the end of 2019, we launched our new strategy. The new strategy is called Change Possible, and it's all really about making that change possible. Through our consultation with staff and students, the one thing that came out loudly, particularly from our students, was the sense of powerlessness that they felt in trying to tackle climate change. And so what we want to try and do through this strategy is give this sense that actually change is possible if we provide the tools and if we provide the means to enable people to make those changes. And so that's very much about how we work with our community to create those tools. The strategy itself is made up of three fundamental elements. The first bit is our vision, which I've already alluded to, that idea that a sustainable future is possible if you create the right tools and the means for people to drive that change. The second part, and I'll drop down to the bottom here, is a series of foundation programs. And I suppose they build a little bit on the question that I put to Nick, which is, we want to create long-lasting change, and we create long-lasting change not by or not just by having our commitments, but also by thinking about how we embed a value such as sustainability into the DNA of an organisation. So it's very much, these foundation programs are very much about how do we make sure that sustainability is part of our decision-making process, that it's within the terms of our committee structures, that our different business units are thinking about sustainability as they make decisions on their business and what they're going to take forward. It's about the education we give our students, and we've wanted to, for a long time, commit as an institution to give all our students an education around sustainability. So that's part of the new strategy. but it's also then about what we do and making more of what we do. And I've alluded to this already, that we're very keen on kind of talking more and giving people more stories about kind of the research we undertake as an institution and sharing that more broadly. And then we've set out 3 signature campaigns, and they are really probably taking the foundations and driving them through 3 particular areas that we as an institution want to address. We want to address our impact on climate change. Sorry, I've managed to lose my screen. There we go. Okay. The second program is called the Loop. And the Loop is very much about unsustainable consumption. So it's about how do we tackle what we purchase, who we purchase from, and try and reduce the amount that we are actually consuming as an institution. The third of our signature programs is around our local environment, and I've talked a little bit about how we want to create change and bring more nature into our campuses. Now, I won't jump to that. With each of these campaigns, we've made some commitments. So we as an institution want to be net zero carbon for our buildings by 2024. We want to be net zero carbon for our institution by 2030. We want to be single-use plastic free by 2024. And we want to create a significant amount more nature-based interventions into our institution. And so we're looking at delivering quite an increase in the amount of green space, green roofs, green walls across our campuses. Up to the pandemic starting, I would say we were on track to do a lot of those pieces of work. There was a lot of planning in place, when you look at kind of what we needed to do and what plans we had in place, I think we'd made significant headway to drive forward to deliver against those commitments. We already have, as Geraint alluded to, a quite systematic approach to looking at emissions in our operations and buildings. We have put in place our sustainability buildings standard, which sets out probably some of the most ambitious standards for new buildings and projects. We've been working to reduce the number of contracts with UCL procurement and also think about sharing platforms for equipment across the institution. We've been looking at how we reuse as much equipment as possible, and Mike talked about Warpit earlier, but we are the UK's university's biggest user of Warpit, so we have the greatest amount of sharing of equipment across our community. We'd already started looking at business travel, and we'd engaged through the academic board to get their in-principle agreement for us to kind of rethink our travel policy. We had quite a significant program on plastics, particularly around reusable cups and catering. And as I've already referred to, we have a lot of engagement across our community. I suppose the pandemic, my initial instinct was, well, what does this all mean? Because we're going to be in lockdown, we're going to be away from campus. Some of the things that we want to do as an institution are very much about our buildings and the place that we work in. But as we've gone through this past year, actually, I think we've seen and we've taken opportunities in the areas where we perhaps might not have thought of them as opportunities at the time. We've still got a very high number of green impact teams. As I said, we've got the highest ever last year. So it suggested to me that even though people were working from home, that people really wanted to find means to engage with their colleagues, their friends, their co-workers. And green impact is a great way of bringing people together. With some of our major projects, we're still driving forward with those, and we're still looking to achieve the high standards that we've set. As a result of people's nervousness about commuting into work, actually we've had a lot of support from the institution to look at how we encourage active travel, walking and cycling. And so there's a great amount of work gone into the new cycling website, but also an increase in the number of cycling spaces across the institution and some of the cycling support infrastructure. As a result of thinking about how we get supplies in for our work over the past year, we've been working with UCL Estates to put in place a logistics structure. And this is very important because it's a way of managing vehicles coming to UCL and reducing the number of vehicles from our suppliers into the university. We've got a new food contract in place that was negotiated last year, but they've just started on campus, and they've got some very ambitious targets themselves with regards to their food they're providing, how they deal with food waste. And we've used this time to also engage with the Wellcome Trust, who have also set some very ambitious targets themselves around climate change. And of course, as we've gone through this last 9 months, 10 months, it's been an opportunity to think about the way we educate, the way we work, to think about why we travel and whether we need to travel, particularly as our virtual environment has improved, to think about the campus environment and how we make more of the campus environment, particularly in a constrained setting, our digital learning environment, and how we make more of that. And I suppose for everybody, myself included, you know, I think this past year has been a great learning experience. As you probably realised just now, I'm still getting to grips with kind of dealing with my digital learning, and then also we're seeing more interest in shared resources. So how do people kind of share what they've got use of with some other communities around UCL? So these are all things that we're going to be looking at as we move forward over the next year, as hopefully we start to come out of this period. What does all this mean for the Institute? I suppose there's 2 or 3 things it'd be really useful for you to get some thoughts from you about. The first thing is LEAF. We know you're adopting the lab efficiency assessment framework. We'd like to see that adopted across all the labs within the Institute, and certainly Martin, who's on the call, would be hugely interested in working with your lab community to try and do that. For those individuals who are not working in labs, then we'd love for you to come to be involved in the Green Impact Programme. And I suppose a shout out to Sarah Lawson and some of the Green champions who've been working in the Institute. You know, any support you can give them to roll out both LEAF and Green Impact, we can as a team, we can always help you and support you with that. We have a new university travel policy, which will be formally launched once we, I think, start to come out of the lockdown. But I suppose the challenge here is how do we maintain our national and international connections, which we know are important for our business, but also reduce the impact of our travel. And I suppose this is an open question and probably a challenge to you as to how you might do that. And again, what we can do as a team is provide you with the data and hopefully some support and advice from what other departments and institutions are doing. Sharing and repairing, we are getting a lot of requests from different institutions and departments about how they might share some of their equipment, but also where people don't want to just throw out broken equipment, but actually repair it. And again, this is something we've been looking into to try and support elements of our community as much as possible. There's a whole series of new procurement measures which are in place, and those have been looking through some of our major contracts around things like stationery and how we can reduce how much we buy, how we can share more. And so we'll be providing more information with the procurement team on what that might mean for you, and hopefully you can share that with your colleagues. And I suppose this is an interesting one, but how do we get you as the Institute of Neurology to be considered the greenest lab in the UK, if not globally? And so sort of more of an open challenge. And with that, I'm going to end there, Mike. And questions.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Richard. That was really, really informative. We're always happy to take up a challenge at Institute of Neurology, and certainly being the greenest lab in UCL would be a great challenge for us to take up. And I know there's a lot of real genuine desire amongst staff and students actually to really contribute to this. And a lot of people have done that already. And as you say, Sarah Lawson and Steffi have really worked hard to champion some of these issues. Geraint posted a number of useful links on the chat line as you gave your talk. For delegates or attendees just to be able to see. I think Martin Farley is on the on the conference. I don't know if he wants to make any specific comments. Martin, do you want to comment at all? So Martin leads on the LEAF scheme, but is he trying to speak but can't?
A nice little comment there. I can't speak, but I think Richard covered it well. Thanks.
Oh yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that, Martin. Any questions for any of Richard's points from attendees? You've been quite shy asking questions. That's fine. Okay. Jippy, nothing else you want to add? Oh yeah, hands up. Your hand up, Jippy. Jippy to the rescue. Good.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. You have been very clear, and your talk was very educational, and clearly resonate a lot with what we are trying to do in the new building in Grazing Road. And I'm particularly fond of sharing equipment and the very well operated and efficient share facility in order to reduce the total number of instruments and have instruments that are better used, better utilized during their lifetime, and in better knit in terms of maintenance. So I think that we are walking this path, but we will need all your help not to lose it.
It's a really good point, and actually, I'm quite pleased to say that SLIMs are ahead of the game when it comes to sharing equipment. So there's sort of, and Geraint just put that in there. The science technology platforms have been, I think, around for probably a couple of years now, but they are becoming increasingly well used across SLIMs as a way of sort of getting access to equipment that you may not have availability or first-hand availability to.
Yeah, I think that Geraint is doing a fantastic job in Central Campus, and some of the facilities are truly state of the art. And yeah, hopefully we are on the right path.
Yeah, and I think your new facility, which is going up on Grazing Road, I mean, we've worked hard with the estates team around the building to make sure that is as efficient as it can be. I mean, the challenge with a building like that is the amount of equipment that's going to go in there, and obviously the equipment itself is going to use a lot of energy. But what we can do through insulation, but also what we can do with how we share equipment is going to all have an impact on the efficiency of that particular unit.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'd add some STPs, like for example, BSU's biological services units. That's 10% of our energy consumption annually at UCL. So say we can get a 40% efficiency in that facility, that is a lot of energy and indeed a lot of money as well. So there's all sorts of opportunity here, which is fantastic.
Yeah, so I just echo Jippy's comments, particularly the work Geraint's done centrally is really impressive, and things like, and Richard, and things like the new student centre is an incredible facility. And what did you say, that's BREEAM super excellent or something?
Outstanding.
Outstanding, yeah. Can you be higher than that?
No.
Only by not existing. So
I think the thing that's nice, Mike, about the science technology platforms is, it's very flattering that people are saying nice things centrally, but fundamentally this is academic leadership by PIs.
Yeah.
So each of those has an academic PI sitting out there in brain sciences, who's working alongside the professional services. So there very much is a place here for academic leadership in this area and supporting our research as well as the sort of the broader institutional commitment.
Right. One other small question I had for Richard actually was, because of my involvement in buildings for the last 9 years, I'm aware just how many building projects there are, before lockdown anyway, going on across UCL, and how could a team of 8 really kind of link to all of these building projects? I guess you have to pick the biggest and most important ones with the biggest impact, do you? Or
well, I mean, I think that's kind of almost leads on from Geraint's point just now. Actually, one of the things we've tried really hard to do, Mike, is take the onus away from us having to do all of the work.
Right.
That actually the programs like Green Impact are all about kind of, I suppose, empowering teams across the institution to take action. And actually, if we're going to try and drive change, it's related a little bit to the question I had to Nick. We can't drive change as a small team. We have to kind of engage with people. We have to have our champions and our ambassadors across the institution, enabling that change to take place within their areas. And when you look at what's happened over the past 10 years, I think probably gives me the most joy is the sense that we have got so many amazing people who are working within their particular departments to drive that change. And it's taken all of the kind of the heat away from me. I think we're in a great place right now to deliver some of the ambition that we've set ourselves.
Great. I'm just looking through the attendee line for any final questions or comments. I can't see any. So obviously I just want to thank all the speakers for great talks. I'm just pleased to hand over to Geraint maybe for a few closing remarks. Geraint, thank you.
So thanks, Mike. It's been an enormously optimistic afternoon. I think if this pandemic has taught us one thing, it's we all need hope in our lives. And presentations like the ones I've heard this afternoon, certainly for me, are the ones that help give me hope. I think I'm most encouraged by the conversations like this are happening on a regular basis across the institution. And so many people turn up and so many people are interested in contributing whenever we go out to speak. And so I do want to thank all the speakers, Sanjay, Nick and Richard, and also you, Mike, and the ION executive for your foresight in putting together this program, because that leadership is all of our responsibility, and it's amazing to see that taking place. But perhaps in closing, I'll say three things. The first thing to say is just a little bit about strategy, and in particular, our institutional strategy that Richard has just talked about so eloquently. And that's building on the point Richard just made, that it doesn't just fall out of the sky, but it's a collective work. It hasn't been done in a darkened room by Richard and a couple of colleagues. It's almost 1,000 people who work together on that strategy. And that, of course, builds on a much broader foundation of individual and collective action, like the Green Champions that Richard was talking about, and colleagues in the Institute of Neurology. So that gives us a huge opportunity to mobilize and network about those actions. We've also got a strong foundation for our strategy in those actions we've already taken. So things that really resonate with me are our commitment to being net zero by 2030, 10 years in advance of the NHS. You heard from Richard that all our electricity, which many people across the institution still don't know, has been from sustainable sources for a couple of years now. And that carbon in our supply chain is really coming under significant scrutiny. So that travel procurement system that you'll see when we emerge from lockdown, should we be able to go to international conferences again, will include carbon lowering and carbon offset options. And people like Mike will get a printout every year of the carbon footprint of the travel within the Institute of Neurology, to do with as we traditionally think fit, to talk about, to discuss, and to work out what we want to do that enables us to deliver our academic mission while at the same time being responsible and sustainable. And we've talked endlessly about buildings. And then perhaps finally in this bit, I'd say we have also a strong commitment to sustainability embedded in our approach to partnerships. It's great that the NHS are here. And of course, we've got fabulous, intimate working relations, particularly in Square with test partners, but more broadly across Bloomsbury. We're an anchor tenant, if you like, in the regional economy. And we can use those relationships both to influence and be influenced in a positive fashion about sustainability. There's no shame in nicking a great policy or a great approach from the NHS, and there's absolutely no shame in insisting in our partnerships round the corner with a coffee shop or whatever, or the NHS or someone in Bloomsbury, that we work together in that way. Second thing I want to say is about purpose. Why would we bother doing this? What's a university for? And a casual observer of the sort of contemporary scene might say, well, it's all about, doing world-leading research, having satisfied students and graduate employment. Those are all really important, but I don't really think, for me, they speak to the purpose of a university, which for many hundred years, as David Price would say if he was here, our purpose has been an enlightenment purpose to generate and disseminate knowledge to transform our societies, our citizens, our patients' lives for the better. And we do that by addressing the major challenges of the day. You know, exhibit one being the pandemic, but what challenge, once that's done, could be greater than that of sustainability? Because of course, what we know is climate heating is linked to biodiversity loss, which in combination with human habitat and human expansion drives those bats, or pangolins maybe, interacting with those humans, and we end up with the situation we have today. So if we talk to our students, you know, they're amazing. 80% of our students say they want to study sustainability now as part of their course. So there's a coming wave out there of young people who want our universities to catalyze that kind of innovation, that kind of opportunity, and help them to become the sustainable leaders of tomorrow, whether they're becoming neuroscientists or biologists or architects. And so we have a responsibility, I think, to do that. Our research, of course, can help. It can create solutions, you know, plastic-eating bacteria, better batteries, behavioral change, and so on. And we're thinking increasingly in terms of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and many of you will have seen those and how we might contribute to those. But coming back, finally, in terms of purpose to our community is very special. It's 48,000 students and 12,500 staff. It's a living laboratory of incredible individuals in which we can test and refine our personal and collective solutions and create a sustainable university, as well as ripple that out into the translational science we do. And so the final thing I want to say is about action. I'm a very pragmatic person, and I think our strategy will only work if it becomes actions, behaviors, choices that change the world. Becoming sustainable will transform the ION, it will transform UCL, and it will transform the world. And that road ahead is undoubtedly long, and there will be undoubtedly many challenges along the way. But we would choose to do that, not because it's easy, but because it is hard. We do the hard things, and the challenges are ones we want to accept and ones we're unwilling to postpone, just as we might think about translational research to cure previously incurable diseases. There is no contradistinction with seeking to combat climate change and become a sustainable organization. So I would say the time for strategy has kind of ended. We've got one. And the time of action is now really beginning in earnest. So it's our actions and our choices that will define our future individually and collectively. It's a super exciting time for UCL, I think. Despite all the challenges of being on Zoom calls, this will be over. And we will be in a different world, and a world in which we have an opportunity to show a sustainable future is not only possible, but better for everyone. So I'm looking forward to seeing ION, as usual, leading the way, and UCL leading the way too. And I can't wait to see what you all can do. Thanks, Mike. Back to you.
Thank you, Geraint, for those really inspiring and helpful comments. And I agree, it's a time for action. And I know there's huge enthusiasm at ION for this, as there is across the university. But thank you for that guidance and for those really positive comments drawing it together. So finally, just to thank all the speakers for great talks, to encourage you all to get involved. There's good links that's on the chat line. There's lots that we need to do together, and it is a time definitely for action. So thanks all for calling in. I think we had over 120 at the peak attending, which is great. So have a nice afternoon and stay safe. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks, Geraint, and thanks to all.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Mike. See ya.
Bye. Bye.